pleasure to welcome you all here to Virginia Seminary this evening. My name is Melody Knowles, and I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs and a Professor of Old Testament. It's just, you never know when you plan these kinds of events who will come, and it really is a pleasure. I hope that you had a chance to enjoy some refreshments on the porch. We'll also, after the event, we'll have some, you get a reward. We'll have heavier hors d'oeuvres after the event. So please join us. We'll have a small presentation for about half an hour. There'll be a time for questions and answers moderated by James Farwell. And then about 7:10 or so, we'll make our way back onto that patio and enjoy the summer evening. I don't know about you, but some days, even on a pleasant summer evening like this, our days feel very noisy, filled with every type of device and object beeping at us or ringing at us. And, you know, we ourselves can make a great deal of noise in our digital worlds where we can effortlessly tweet or Facebook or somehow touch just an infinite number of people with our own messages. So that's why I'm so struck by your piece tonight here that we're sharing. This infinite, noisy digital world. Who doesn't get the voice? Who doesn't get to speak? Who needs to be heard? And how can these voices break through our very noisy worlds? Michael Takeo Magruder is a visual artist working with new media in our media-rich world. And currently, I'm very proud to say, he's our current artist in residence as we host a preaching program here at Virginia Seminary called Deep Calls to Deep. Teaching all of these, helping to explore all these preachers with this very text-driven agendas, how to make them maybe think about the visual as well as the text. He includes real-time data, digital archives, immersive environments, mobile devices, and virtual worlds as he explores media criticism, digital formalism, and computational aesthetics. I don't even think that they had that word when I was at school. Computational aesthetics. In the past 15 years, Michael's projects have been showcased in 250 exhibitions in 34 countries. And the work, which I'm sure you've all already seen, Lamentation for the Forsaken, juxtaposes Christ's journey to the cross with the plight of refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war. Your conversation partner tonight will be our own Reverend Dr. James Farwell. He came to Virginia Seminary in 2012 as professor of theology and liturgy and has had a rich life serving both the academy and the church. His work is in liturgical and sacramental theology, theories of ritual and religion, comparative theology, and theologies of religious pluralism. As well as being a parish priest, he's studied and taught at institutions like the General Theological Seminary, Catholic University of America, Bethany College, Drew University, and Bexley Hall, and probably some others that he'll tell me about later that I forgot. In addition to publishing numerous articles, essays, and reviews, he's also the author of the book, This is the Night, Suffering, Salvation, and the Liturgies of Holy Week. It's a book I highly recommend to you all to read once a year during Holy Week. And has recently written a new version of the classic primer, The Liturgy Explained. Currently, he's working on The Eucharist, a book-length topic on ritual ethics and belief in Western Christianity for New York University Press. One of our most popular professors and a deep thinker, and I can't imagine a better conversation partners to have here to host our guest. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear someone read my bio, I sound so much more impressive than I know myself to be. But
it feels the same way.
Good. It is good to have you here. I don't know how you all connect to art projects, but when I go in to see an art exhibition, sometimes I read all the material, and sometimes I go straight to the art object and maybe read the material later, or maybe not at all. I don't know if everybody then got the chance to read some of what was posted on the wall out here or to see all or part of the video, but I thought just to get us all started on a common ground, I might just begin by inviting you to share with the group a little bit about the project, about the occasion for it, about why you did this piece, whatever you want to say about that, including what it illustrates about how you do art as an artist? Why don't we start there?
Okay. Well, first of all, just a big thank you to the seminary for inviting me to present the work here. It's a piece that's very close to my heart. A lot of what I do with my work is not try to make beautiful things, but produce provocative experiences, things that can kind of open up important social issues of our time. This piece, Lamentation for the Forsaken, is a really good example of that, insofar as that it represents in the Syrian refugee crisis something that I think we as the West, and I speak both as an American by birth, but also as a British national, I hold 2 citizenships, that both America and Europe have really failed, let's call it what it is, failed in this particular circumstance, that we have allowed this to kind of go on during our watch. So in 2016, I was invited by Dr. Aaron Rosen, who's a really well-known academic and curator, based now in Montana, but he used to be based at King's College in London. And he had invited me to produce a piece for a Stations of the Cross exhibition that he was putting on. But it, unlike many other exhibitions with that theme, the difference is that he wanted to create this walking tour through the city of London, where he would take contemporary artworks, commission new contemporary artworks by artists like myself, but mix those with historical artworks and also monuments, and this idea of a pilgrimage around the city to see and sort of to think about stations in a different way. And when Aaron approached me to produce a work for the show, I said, okay. I told him that I was not going to produce an explicitly religious piece, but of course I would produce a piece that was related to Christ's journey to the cross. But I wanted to produce something that would speak to all nations, people of all nations, all religions, all nationalities, all creeds. So I asked him if I could have the 13th station. Jesus' body is taken down from the cross. And I wanted to use that as the framework to discuss the Syrian refugee crisis. So taking the story of Jesus, the story of his suffering, the story of his death, and use that as a lens to then consider the plight of the Syrian refugees. So the work takes the image of Christ. I chose the Turin Shroud image, not because whether it's real or not was of no concern to me, but I thought this is the image that everyone in the West would see as the image of Christ. They would identify with that culturally. They would come with it to a certain perspective. So I took that image and then digitally reconstructed it using the names and information about Syrians who had died in the conflict. I data mined those names from Twitter. There was an activist project called How Many More Syrians that had cataloged the deaths of all the civilians that had died in the conflict. At that time, they had compiled a book of Syria's Dead, which had 100,000 names. And now they've done a volume. They're doing a volume 2, because since that time, another 100,000 people had died. And then to sort of create that image, to recreate that image, where the image of Christ is now made of a textual weave of the names of the dead. And then to take that image, to break it into 4 parts, the head of the face of Christ, which then you see the images of faces of the Syrians, the individuals, the body of Christ, images of the dead, there from the conflict, the hands of Christ juxtaposed to images of the Syrians trying to help each other survive, and the legs of Christ, the feet of Christ, the images of the Syrians trying to escape their homeland, their journey, their pilgrimage, their sort of progression as they try to save themselves and their loved ones. And for me, again, being both a British American and all the issues that I see that are coming out now in the way that politics has changed, and the very divisive, the very hateful kind of rhetoric that is getting put forward, often being underpinned by religious theory, that I thought, well, instead of trying to engage with this section of the population and just say, you're wrong, I thought, okay, well, there are always more productive ways, because truth is always in inverted commas, small t, as I was discussing with Melody earlier. And with that in mind, as an artist, what I try to do is to get people to see from a different perspective. If I take a story, a Christian story, a story of Jesus, that people that I'm trying to speak to will say, of course, that provides a fundamental structure to their beliefs that they cannot disagree with, that they subscribe to. And I say, okay, if we use this as a lens to see this other issue, that our opinions on how to deal with that widely differ, and if as an artist I do that juxtaposition right, then perhaps they go away and they think a little differently. Perhaps they all of a sudden say, okay, well, is this the right way to do? Can't we see, the story of Christ in the story of these people and such? So that's really what I've tried to do with the piece. And then another aspect of it is I also believe in a call to action, for a lack of a better term. So these kinds of projects, they're always not for profit. I refuse to make any money off of it. And it's been such a pleasure that VTS and then Wesley Seminary before asked to take on the piece. For me, it's about promoting dialogue and then also doing fundraising. So just a small plug. Working with the curators of the station show, I produced a very limited edition set of prints, one you see here. And anyone that donates $500 or more to the International Rescue Committee, which is an organization seeking to support the Syrian refugees, will receive a print, as long as there are some still available. Anyway, so that kind of, I hope, gives a background to the piece.
Get out those checkbooks, folks. Get out those checkbooks. It's a good cause. So, one of the things that strikes me about the work, and I'm interested in the way that you say, and I've heard you say this a couple of times now in your lecture yesterday, and we talked about it a little bit at dinner a couple of nights ago. I'm intrigued by the way in which you speak of this, and I'm going to try to quote you fairly closely. You said, I'm not going to use an explicitly religious piece of work. Even if I do, I'm going to do something with it that speaks to a wide range of people. Talk about that a little bit and how you understand the interface between your work and religion, or perhaps even your work and the religious. And what's behind my question there is your sense that art is meant to help us see something a little differently that we didn't see before. You even used the word in your lecture yesterday, a kind of unveiling.
Yes.
And I was immediately struck at how powerful and central the image of unveiling or epiphany or revelation is,
Absolutely.
if not to all of the world's religious traditions, certainly to the theistic traditions, certainly to some of the South Asian traditions. So when I look at your work, I see something that feels religious in that sense of opening something up to sight that I might not have seen otherwise. And yet you're very careful to think of your work as not religious in the explicit sense. Yes. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
If I produced a Christian work for a Christian audience, then by definition, that would actually put a barrier between so many people and such. Art and spirituality are both universal things. I am a Christian, but I am a Christian because I was born into a Christian household, raised by a Christian family and such. And I've often commented to people that if I was born in a Muslim household, I could be equally religious, equally spiritual. I could be, but I wouldn't be Christian, and such. And in our society, I think art should be able to speak to everyone. I think that if I produced a work that was explicitly religious also, that then perhaps it would be easier for people to perhaps use it for something that I did not intend. Because again, I had a wonderful conversation when the piece was in London with the Cardinal of Westminster and the Bishop of London. They had found out about the work. They had asked to take a pilgrimage to see the piece.
And a bit of that is on the video
Yes,
outside, right?
outside.
So if you didn't have the chance to see that.
Yes, and it's available online as well. But one of the very profound things that the Cardinal of Westminster brought up was that the story of Christ, he saw it, was a story of humanity and could speak, on that very human level. And certainly with the work like this, it's something that I was trying to accomplish. It was to say, okay, if we take these people, can we stop seeing them as refugees? Can we see them as individuals and use that great maxim, there but for the grace of God am I? Because even, say, a hardcore atheist, should be able to appreciate the fact the only difference between growing up here and growing up there is just the fortune of where you were born and such. And that if we reduce people to just numbers, what is that? We need to, and perhaps through art, in something that is more universal, think about people as a brother, a sister, a father, a mother, a child, a friend, a colleague. That's what these people, that's what they are. It could be here. One of the great things that I thought that Mark brought up in his half of the lecture was, and also in conversations with me, what is the difference between Syria and the south side of Chicago? And I said to him later, I was like, well, there certainly are differences, but one thing that is absolutely the same is that we are all responsible. In a democracy, we all have culpability. And we need to do our part and such. Whether, in his case, as a preacher, my case, as an artist, this is important and such. So my desire to keep my work secular, even if I'm using a Christian narrative and Christian sort of narratives and iconography, it really is to produce work that has the chance to speak to everyone, really. It's as simple as that.
I also find myself wondering whether your growing up Christian doesn't shape the sensibility you bring to the work that you do, certainly a work of this kind. And I mean that in the sense that certainly in the Jewish and the Christian traditions, giving testimony to a pivotal past event, standing as witness in memory to something powerful, whether it's the deliverance of the people of Israel, the Passover, or whether it's the remembrance of the crucified and risen Christ in the Christian tradition. There's something really important about giving witness that happens through memory and testimony, and from that memory and testimony arises hope for the future, hope for the change. I don't know if you've thought at all about that, but as I see the work and I hear you talk about it in your relationship to the religious, I wonder, even though you're not attempting to do a work that you would call a theological work, whether your own sensibility of bearing witness is not deeply informed by your own having grown up Christian. Have you thought at all about that?
I actually have never thought about that, but with you mentioning that, I could see that very well being the case, insofar as that I'm a firm believer that I trained in science, and I'm a firm believer that one is the sum total of their genes and their experiences. And in terms of experiences, I grew up in Virginia. I grew up in a religious household, in a religious community and such, and it would be very naive of me to say that that did not inform me. The fact that I was actually I read the book of Revelation when I was 6, 7 years old for the first time. That in itself says something. Of course, that comes,
Yes.
As a child, that comes from your family,
Yes.
having access to that, or that even being an idea of something to do. So yes, certainly I could subscribe to that. That it's come through influence.
One of the things, too, that strikes me about the shroud, and I'd be curious to know if you've thought anything about this. When you speak about why you chose the shroud image, you focus primarily, and for very obvious and defensible reasons, on that image as a reminder of the death of Christ. So then the suffering and the wounds of the Syrian refugees get overlaid into a human story represented in the wounds and the death of Christ. What's interesting about that shroud, though, of course, and I'm with you, we will bracket whether this thing really is or isn't factually, the radiocarbon testing doesn't suggest so far that it actually goes back to the time of Jesus. And yet it functions as a kind of an icon. And the interesting thing about it for Christians is that it functions as an icon not simply as a reminder of the dead Christ, but the claim, whatever one makes of it, is that the image is on the cloth because it is showing some evidence of the moment of the power that raised Jesus. So the Shroud of Turin is testament not only to the dead Christ, but to the Christ who was raised. Now, when I look with that in mind at the art that you have done, I see it both as a witness and a remembrance, but also as a testament to the possibility of change and hope. I don't know if that played any role in your thinking at all, the sort of resurrection side of the shroud, or were you really thinking of it just primarily as a burial shroud?
I was thinking of it in terms of as a burial shroud, but in the conversations that I had with the head priest of St. Stephen Walbrook Church, which is the church, it was originally the first iteration of the work was purposely built for. It was a wonderful connection that Aaron had made because we were both very much preoccupied with the refugee crisis and also the fact that we thought so many segments of society, including the church, according to Jonathan, in England, they weren't doing enough or were just working along unproductive lines. And as I described to him the kind of piece that I had in my mind that I wanted to produce, one of the things that came up in that conversation was, the idea of hope. And interesting that, of course, he completely understood why I wanted to produce a work that I saw as a secular piece, using the Christian narrative to make a certain juxtaposition in a certain social point. But I said, part of this narrative, of course, is the resurrection, is the hope at the end. And we then started talking about how, with this work, that our hope was that it would be a call to action in a small way, that we couldn't solve the crisis, either his church or myself as an artist, but we could do our part. We could also provide a mechanism for other people that would actually experience the work different ways to contribute and such, which is why we did various events, which were fundraising events, produced them, then that came on to produce the print and then other things. And yeah, so really, I didn't think about it in the terms you described, but I do remember that conversation with Jonathan, how we were talking about, a hopeful call to action. because in any situation that is so seemingly complex and seemingly sort of out of control, the way that you can start chipping away at it to bring hope is through individual action.
And that, of course, is really consistent with the way that you've described how you understand art in general, if I can use that phrase.
Yes.
Or maybe you just mean that of your art, I don't know, but I've heard you speak a couple of times now about art as opening something up, making something possible. So there's a kind of an instrumental power in the artistic act there.
Yes.
I mean, it's very different. I don't hear you giving us a discursus on Kantian form and beauty as such, or whatever.
Yes.
Right? It matters when you do your art that it opens up the possibility of something. Yes.
Absolutely. And I do subscribe that for me, that is what all art should be. I am no longer interested, I've never been interested in something that is just a beautiful thing or an interesting conceptual idea. For me, conceptual art, aesthetic art, that should actually be a given. In art history, we have been there. We have done that. And now in this day, in this age, in my generation, really, for me, the great pieces of work are the pieces of work that are socially engaged as well. It can be provocative, it can be beautiful, but it also has to be above all relevant.
How important do you think it is that a work of art like this, now I'm aware that you've done a range of things and you've exhibited in, what do you call them, white cube art exhibition spaces, you've exhibited, as you're exhibiting this here, in a sacred space. How important is the space in which the art is exhibited to the power of the art to do what you want it to do? What would happen if this piece of art were out on the Grove under a tent and not in a religious space? Do you think that plays a role? Do you spend a lot of time thinking about, when you do art, what sort of spaces it belongs in? Is that important?
Absolutely. It's absolutely critical. Insofar as that, I think space in architecture, for several reasons, I think about not only doing something that is site-specific, but something that is also context-specific and culturally specific. So the idea of using church spaces, and this is not the first project that I've used a church space, because on a cultural level you have notions of the transcendental. Again, the church space, even whether you're a believer or a non-believer, it really doesn't matter. People approach a church space like they approach a gallery in a certain sort of mindset that is kind of culturally conditioned into us. So that's a very powerful device to use. The second thing is in terms of the architecture and the history. So for this, again, this work being created, about a Christian narrative for a pilgrimage that was made for a pilgrimage for a Stations of the Cross exhibition, it would be very bizarre for it to not be in that space. The way the piece has been designed in itself, the first iteration for the church in London was much lower to the ground. It was built on a structure that was color matched and sort of felt like, how in England there are low-lying tomb structures. So that's how I made the aesthetics of the piece to sort of fit within the space. Bringing the piece over here and creating a second version for the Stations DC, where, yes, the Church of the Epiphany, it's a very beautiful church, but if it's a different style, it's a different feel. It has a different kind of architecture, which there's a lot more wood features. So again, if my purpose is, as an artist, to try to integrate this into the core sort of fabric of the building, both architecturally and culturally, and even for people spiritually, then doesn't it make sense to actually bring all the elements together? I wouldn't be a very good artist if I just tried to take something and just keep plopping it down in random spaces. And I think, for example, if you took that piece, yes, of course you could show it in a clinical white wall, white cube gallery space, but it would lose, I think, a lot of its power, a lot of its character, because the piece is not just the object, but it's the environment, it's the context in which it's shown.
And there are so many associative meanings that people bring with them in that space.
Absolutely.
I actually, myself, in looking at it, even though it's not as low as you described it was in its first showing, it still feels to me, I don't know if it does to others here, very much like a tomb.
Yes.
And what it put me in mind of, now I'm enough of a liturgy nerd that I know these sorts of things as well, but it put me in mind of the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition, where on Holy Saturday, a kind of object reminiscent of the body of Jesus is literally laid on the floor, or in some cases on the altar, but often right on the floor in the chancel in the Orthodox space, and the burial of Christ is remembered in that way, with a kind of a mimetic reenactment of his burial. So when I walked into that space, I immediately was put in mind of this sort of Holy Saturday remembrance of the burial of Christ, which of course again then for me immediately has me thinking about the hope of the resurrection, and it helped me to connect the hope that was resident in the witness that your art object draws out of us, I think. I suspect that people have questions that they would like to put to you from the audience. I think we're about at that time. Do you want to walk around with the mic so people can be heard? Oh, Sarah's got the mic. Please.
To indulge in criticism of your work and ask if you could, or if you were starting over again, how would you, in what way would you want to change it, and why?
Well, one of the great frustrations and powers of both a frustration and a beauty of working in new media, digital media, is that everything is always in what I call beta revision. So a process of the technologies evolve, we can keep changing the works. In terms of the core aesthetics and concept of it, I'm actually very pleased. And for that part, I wouldn't change anything, because the way it's been received in a lot of different circles, in the academic community, in the religious community, in the arts community, have all been immensely positive. So that I use as my validation that I found the right balance. In terms of the aesthetic structure itself, I'm pleased that the piece is sort of held up to this impromptu tour, but it never was intended to be, and such. And it was, of course, made to a specific budget and such for a specific context. I have thought about how I would do it if it were the curator, Aaron, has had thoughts about how an organization might wish to make a large donation to the RRC to have a permanent version, sort of the definitive version, or one of the last iteration done. And in that I have thought about, what kind of materials I would use, how I would design it, and such. And certainly that aesthetically it's become more refined from the first iteration in London to the next iteration that is here. And if I did a third iteration, it would become more refined as well. I see it kind of like, if I think about sort of painters from the 50s and 60s that would sort of, paint things and refine the process and refine the aesthetics to get closer to try to the sort of sublime and transcendental sort of qualities. That's not something that often just kind of happens magically. It's something that you actually have to work on the process and you have to refine. So I would certainly do that. And of course, in relation to the final space that it would be shown in, because that would be absolutely essential.
Right.
It would end up being very site-specific.
And I love that in your work, because you work in digital media, that you just defined the definitive as the latest iteration.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
a very different way of thinking about
Yes.
a definitive piece of work of art compared to other schools of
Yes.
aesthetics, right? So it's fascinating. Others? We have other questions?
Yes, Michael, you mentioned that there was an organization that was compiling the list of names of the deceased from
Yes.
the Syrian crisis, and that you had 100,000 to begin with. There's a volume 2 that has more. Are all 100,000 names shown on the exhibit back there, or a sample? And then
No.
my second question is,
Okay.
much as I like it, were there other runners-up or other ideas about the iconic Western image of Christ's face that you considered?
Okay. Well, I'll start with that one. No, there weren't. Because it was the one that just immediately came to mind. And sometimes, as an artist, sometimes the idea just, you know exactly what you want to do. And you know certain parts of the work that when you're bringing together all these different things, I think of myself more as a remixer of culture than a traditional maker of things. So when I'm pulling from culture to do my remix, that component was one of the first to fall into place. And I knew absolutely, I was like, no, this is what it's going to be. And never had a second thought about that. In terms of the names, that does bring up an interesting point, because I would have loved to include all 100,000 names from that first volume. And I could have obtained them. That would have been challenging, but easy enough to do. But the issue was more, I wanted the final experience. I started thinking about, I want them to be legible. Not like a monument, not like a monument where, you know, you just see the typeset rows of names that are very readable. I use actually an old op art technique, so you have multiple layers of the reconstructed shroud image made of the textual weave of the names and also the metadata. And I would point out that the metadata was very important, because a lot of these victims, their names aren't recorded, just a man from Aleppo, for example, because such is the case of the destruction that entire neighborhoods were wiped out. So all memory of who these people were has been completely erased. You know, all they know is a little girl from Homs, a man from Aleppo. That's, you know, they have just been reduced. And I thought that was a very powerful thing that I discovered, and I wanted that to be communicated in the work. And I wanted the work to be legible, to be readable, but only when you approached that, you know, playing with the idea of different perspectives, and from a distance, you see the images, you see the image of Christ, or you see the news media images being there remixed in real time. But it's only upon approaching the piece that you start to see the text and get a sense of the names, and then you can kind of barely read them. And it's one of those things that conceptually I wanted to include them all, the whole book, but I knew in practice, of course, I could do that, but then nothing would be legible, because it would be micro print. And then that, in terms of the effect that I was trying to have, would be so much lessened, because you wouldn't know that there were names and information. So that, unlike the shroud image, which was the immediate, this is how I'm going to do it, when it came to dealing with the names and the information about the victims, you know, that was, I probably did maybe 24 different kind of print tests to figure how many could I actually get on with still retaining the aesthetic properties that I wanted, to still make it legible, so on and so forth. And that was a challenging sort of artistic sort of process and decision that I had to come to, because I did want to include them all.
And it's almost then as if, as the body, the image of the body of Christ signifies the suffering and the wounds of the Syrian refugees, so it is that the names that you have made legible then signify all the others that are not
Absolutely.
named. So there's a sort of
Absolutely.
pointing beyond
Yes.
itself in both cases.
That's
very rich.
That's very insightful, because that for me is how I resolve that conflict within myself of wanting to achieve something, wanting to include everything,
Yeah.
To give everyone a voice, but knowing that I couldn't.
Yeah.
So yes.
I was struck, one is an observation, having been to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, that the height of it is actually interesting. It's very reminiscent of what is revered as the place where Jesus was laid afterwards. And so they, the people will put oil and water and wash it. And so you have this, it's a visual that feels very reminiscent. My other question, though, is, this is a little odd, but I can see between your discussion with James about the hope of it crossing over, but could you speak at all about the dissonance between what is ascribed as a theology with of a death with meaning versus a deaths without meaning? A priest.
That explains a lot.
Okay. Deaths with meaning versus deaths without meaning. That's a very good question, and it's something that I haven't reflected on in this work. I mean, maybe I should answer it from a very personal standpoint. I mean, death is a part of life, so that's something that we all expect. We deal with in different ways, but in the same sort of mindset, I just look at a crisis like what's going on in Syria. And I can understand, because I spend so much time engaged in exploring media and politics and social issues, that I had followed the Syrian crisis years before it was a topic in the media. And I could see it unfold. I could see this kind of happening. Because if you can make those connections and you can draw things to logical outcomes given sort of past, past histories and past sort of workings of nation states, that you can kind of see this unfolding. But because I maintained then and I maintain now that we certainly could have done better, that this did not need to happen, and that it is deaths that were preventable, and a catastrophe that was imminently stoppable. And in that, I think that, yes, this is, I don't know, I would have to think more about whether I would use the meaningful versus meaningless, but I would certainly say, it is a great tragedy and a waste of life. Sometimes we have to accept death, and there's nothing that can be done, and it just is what it is. But this was not one of those circumstances, not at all. And that I do despair of the West for when we in our positions of privilege, and I speak both of North America and Europe, that we allow these things to happen. And, and this is, even in my lifetime, the Rwandan genocide, the war in the Balkans, and now Syria, it's like, no. So I would say that it's very hard for me to think of this as an individual, of the death of these several 100,000 people, as having any meaning in their death. I see it as this great tragedy and a waste of life that we are partially responsible for. I don't know if that answers your question.
Probably have time for one or two more.
I'm a little interested in the logistics of putting this piece together. I mean, I know you had to get the names from an organization, but you also had to get all of those photographs. And
Yes.
what kind of time frame was this? And just give us a little idea of the logistics of putting this together.
With these kind of projects, I always have, they're always based on a long period of research. I was already a follower of the sort of the stories and the discourses that were surrounding the issue. But in terms of when it came time to do the piece, I had about a 6-month period. Not that I was working on it full time, but to start exploring various media sites and also social network sites, social network repositories, to collect the images. And of course, what I did for that is I collected everything, but then I pared it down to a curated set because I didn't want to, if I had just thrown the sort of the 1,000 of images in each category that I had found, then of course you retain the media bias or the bias of people actually posting. So I took the artistic license to then curate a subset of 40 for each section, to give what I felt was a more accurate, fair reflection. One of the obvious examples in that is that with the fleeing of the Syrians from their homeland, in the media would often portray the images as just the Syrians sort of coming into Europe. But the truth of it was that was like the final fourth or third of their journey. Their great sort of trials just to get out of the cities that were under siege and then sort of crossing the other Arab states in the desert to then reach the Mediterranean or to go the route of the Balkans to then come up into Europe and such. So what I tried to do is sort of pare things down to give it a more accurate, a more sort of, again, in small t and little quotes, a truthful view in my perspective of the situation. The names of the victims, those were all data mined through Twitter because the organization, not only did they publish a book, but they also did protests, one which was actually in DC, where they would read out, they stood in front of the White House and they read out names like every 10 seconds. And they also tweeted them on Twitter. So of course, you being from computer science, know that once it exists on the online space, it pretty much always exists on the online space. So I just basically ran search queries and pulled out the data and then went through and cleaned it up to remove just name and metadata and such. But it took about 6 months. And in these kind of projects, there's never enough time. One's view, one's research is always an incomplete and impartial view and such. But that's life. You try to get the best sense of the picture as you can. And always, as an artist, what I try to do, working in this kind of ethical space, is that leave myself open to be, for something else to be brought to my attention or to be said, well, no, this isn't correct. And then, of course, back to the first question, I would change the piece and such. But in this case, that certainly hasn't happened. But that kind of gives a mind. And then in terms of the building and the logistics and all those other things, it's difficult supporting this kind of work and such, and touring this kind of work is very difficult. Actually, one friend of mine in the audience, sitting in the back, Ryan, who has the red shirt on, it was the tour to both VTS and Wesley was only possible because he stepped in and actually did the technical sort of moving of the piece. And again, for the host institutions have put a lot of time and energy to make it possible as well. So I always think of these projects as really being, yes, I'm the lead artist, but I very much work in collaboration and dialogue with the curators, collaboration with, the people that sort of help me realize the project. And in many ways, maybe long gone. Well, for me, I'm not the artist in the sense of someone who paints and creates something wholly by themselves and then can just hand it over and say, okay, there you go. It's maybe more like the director of a theater production where I'm sort of bringing together all these skills and then together, yes, I'm the artist, I have the idea, but then certainly realizing it, bringing it into a reality for people to experience. It's far beyond me and far beyond what any one person could do.
We want you all to be able to eat, and you would have the opportunity to approach Michael with other questions individually, so perhaps this conversation can continue over the reception. I just want to say for myself, I think the work that you have done there in this object stands in the best tradition of prophetic witness, and that tradition is always cross-religious. It always speaks beyond the bounds of the source of the religious imagery or the tradition it may be associated with. And as such is truly a beautiful object, really beautiful. So thank you for
Thank
this.
you.